Diego's grades are bad. Screw him. It's not your problem, right? And that goes for anything, if poverty, etc., etc. People's problems are not your problems. And in a way that's liberating, right? You're liberated from this moral slavery to morals, to the church, to whatever, whoever wants to control you, right? If they don't pay you, they have no right to that. On the other hand, you're also liberated from protection, right? Nobody's going to help you. If your child, like mine, had lung problems when they were born, and you're in a private hospital, they'll tell you, oh, well, we can put him in this little bed with a lamp and some oxygen, and that will cost you 50,000 pesos a day. Or do you want him to die? What do you want to do? You're like, okay, well, let's do that. And if the insurance doesn't cover that, well, then you better have savings. Luckily, my son only needed this for 4 days. But you are not protected from these type of things. By the way, they charged us, you know, when your baby is born, they measure it. They charged us for the measuring tape. Like I saw it on the bill. They charged me 119 pesos to measure him at birth.
Why? Like, what's
Because
the point? Like, just
when I paid, it's like, I want this tape, and they went and they brought me the tape that I paid for. Like, apparently I owned it, so I wanted it. I don't know, because they can charge for anything, right? And you're in a market, you're not going to refuse this. Like when he's 3 seconds old, they're like, do you want to know how long he is? You're like, yes. Okay, pay now. You're like, what? Anyway, you stand alone in the market. But theoretically, unless we're talking about healthcare, education, or anything important, you will have cheaper prices in this market, right? That's the return for it. You are alone, but in exchange for that, we're going to have efficient services, and they're going to be cheap. And that's what people want. That's one of the base premises of neoliberal economic theory, is that what people want above everything else is cheap. As long as you can provide cheap, people are going to be happy. Without that premise, not much stands of the theory. So that's neoliberalism, right? There's a lot more to say about it, and I have said more things about it in the past, and we're going to discuss it more next time. But in short, that's what we're talking about. I'm going to switch a bit now to the, I don't know if this is the left or the right, I think to the right, and talk about libertarianism. Unless you have any questions so far. Let me go back. Do you have any questions, Mr. Hugo?
No, teacher, everything is very clear.
Okay, very good. Then let's talk about libertarianism. I will not spend too much time on it, because libertarianism is not actually important. I know it might hurt you if you're a libertarian, but libertarian is like a 1% type of ideology globally, probably less than 1%. But you might have heard the word, and I want to explain it, right? Libertarianism really is a variant of anarchism, or at least that's where it comes from. It comes before neoliberalism. Libertarianism was a synonym for anarchism. The problem is that anarchism is usually considered, again, as some kind of extreme variant of communism, like the far left of communism, or the far right of it, however you want to put it. Anyway, it's a left-wing ideology historically. They used to be friends with the communists because they wanted to bring down capitalism. Because capitalism and the state are kind of married in most countries. That's not what this is, right? Libertarianism is, let's say, the right wing of anarchism splitting off. Is this pro-capitalist, anti-collective variant that in the 70s separated itself and started drifting fully to the right, to the end of the right-wing spectrum. And you see this more often, that the far right usually comes from the left. Like the left people are very, how do you say this? Very vengeful when they feel betrayed. Like you see this often in politics. When somebody of the left leaves the left, they'll go all the way to the right. And that's what happened here. But neoconservatism, that also happened. Anyway, I talk too much.
Doctor,
Yes.
What should I understand by anti-collective?
Anarchism has many variants, but the most huggable one, like the one that I would feel most comfortable with talking about, is the idea that people naturally live in small communities. That you and let's say 30 people live together in some kind of farm slash factory that makes your own stuff. And that's kind of how anarchists envision the world, the ideal world. So you have collectives. You have nothing higher, but you don't literally live on your own either. It's like a small village thing. And libertarians don't want that. They don't want to live in a farm with people. They want to live in a condo in the city. Anyway, so they're against that. And they rally their whole ideology around this idea of absolute freedom, right? You might have seen their flag of the snake, right? Don't trap my liberty, as they would say, usually with a southern accent. So don't step on my freedom is the idea here, right? That would summarize it. It's a good flag for them. In the modern use of it, which is the American use, libertarianism is an American ideology. This barely exists in any other country. The idea here is that it seeks individual freedom above all other things, right? It's a type of liberalism that, yes, it's for freedom, negative freedom, the freedom to be left alone. But this is more important than anything here, right? And it's in capitalism. So it seeks for maximum freedom. People should be able to do anything as long as they're not violent. That's kind of the end of this. You can inflict harm on people if it's indirectly, right? If you're smoking and they're around you and they get cancer, that's okay. But you cannot be violent. But outside explicit violence, as in hitting somebody with an axe, outside that, people should be fully free in a libertarian society, right? How exactly you protect them is questions unanswered, but outside that, there should be total deregulation. So if you want to do drugs, if you want to have a sweatshop with 9-year-olds working, if you want to have whatever weird sexual fantasy and live with 7 men, then this is how it should be, right? People should be fully free here, for better or worse. And what's interesting is that, unlike neoliberals, libertarianism isn't actually utopian. They don't expect this to lead to a perfect world. They very well understand that if you do this, trouble will happen, right? These rules exist for a reason. They're not random. That societies have laws. All societies have laws, and they have so for reasons. If you take away those laws, chaos will happen. Libertarians just say that they prefer chaos over oppression, right? They'll say, yeah, this will lead to bad things, and some people will die because they cannot afford healthcare, for example. But hey, that's on them, right? They should have saved money, or they should not have gotten sick, or whatever. But this has nothing to do with me. So they accept that this has negative consequences. They simply value freedom higher than anything else, right? Unlike liberalism, they prefer freedom over order, for example. So in that sense, it's consistent. It's just a fully single value-driven ideology. And that means that the state is always bad. Even if they're trying to help you, they're bad, right? Unlike neoliberalism. Neoliberalism will use the state if it's handy, if it's in their advantage. Libertarians will not. And that gives them some type of consistency. Not a consistency I'm personally interested in, but let's say a fool's consistency, or no, that's too negative. Anyway, for example, they will always be against the war. Whatever the cost or whatever the reason is, or how good your reason is, they'll just be consistently against war, because that means government spending, right? Not because life is important or something like that, but that means the government's going to spend, and that's bad, and so we shouldn't do it. And so they're quite reliable in that sense. They're very predictable what they're going to do, and that's good, I think. And what makes them also very radical is that libertarians will try to privatize everything. That's the same with neoliberalism, except that everything here means everything. So that includes roads, for example, all roads, also the ones in your street. So you're gonna have to pay someone if you want to go to the bakery next time. That means the police, for example, that means the army, that means everything should be privatized. How? I don't know. I don't think this is possible, and no one ever done it. But that's what they want, and they spelled a good deal of daydreaming about how you could, for example, privatize the police. Again, don't ask me, but if you Google it, you're going to find answers. Because they have tried it, or they've tried it on paper at least. So they want this, they basically don't want the state to exist. But they do want capitalism to exist, which requires the state to some extent. Now, in practice, libertarianism is neoliberalism. In political practice, in people in parliament, right? You have a libertarian party in the United States, but they don't win elections. The people who actually win elections are the Republicans, right? And they have a libertarian wing. And that's where they kind of fit in. So in principle, libertarians are going to fit in with neoliberalism, sometimes conservatism or fascism, in the case of Brazil, for example. But on their own, this is not a player in politics. On its own, libertarianism is so extreme that this is a true minority ideology. Let's say 4% of Americans are in favor of this, and the rest of the world, maybe a few handful of people. Because most people on earth simply don't want to sacrifice everything for freedom. They want to eat. They want things for their family. They don't want to be free over everything, right? This is a true, well, let's say unique ideology here. But I want you to understand the difference with others. But in practice, they're going to vote neoliberal. And they're going to be the same faction, although in theory they're a bit different. So libertarianism, in short, could be interesting. I don't think there's a libertarian Mexican party. So in San Pedro, I think there is, but you could try to join them if you want to.
Doctor,
Yes.
but just to see if I did understand, in neoliberalism, your freedom is regulated by the capitalist class,
Mm-hmm.
and like they don't seek to individual freedom. They just
No, it's not their priority.
okay.
They
Got
will, but they don't have, like, for example,
They just see
if you
as a
take
consumer.
if you take abortion, for example, or euthanasia, these, for classic liberalism, these are important things. For neoliberalism, it's important, but not if saying the opposite will get you more votes. Like if that gets you more votes, and if siding with the conservatives gets you more votes, and therefore you can privatize more companies, you're gonna do it. So it's just a matter of priority. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
So classical liberal parties are quite rare actually nowadays, because neoliberalism kind of ate them. Now, let's talk a bit about the practice of this. Yes, I still have time left. Good. Let's talk a bit about the practice of this. This is nothing new, right? You've heard about neoliberalism before. You see it in other classes. So let's quickly go over this, just to make sure you understand it for your next homework, for example. So some practical neoliberal measures taken from my globalization course. Privatization, that's an obvious one, right? Privatization of public enterprises. Let's say you have, this state has a particularly successful telecommunication company, and you privatize that, you can create some very rich people. The deregulation of the economy, the more the entrepreneurs are hindered by rules, well, the less capital can flow. So neoliberals will try to reduce the number of rules that are there, and to also get rid of, for example, environmental restrictions on things, etc. You have the liberalization of trade and industry. They will try to push for as many things to be legal to trade them as possible, right? And to create as many markets as possible, right? To turn education into a market, for example, and to set these industries free from whatever restraints they have. You have tax cuts. Taxes got more or less cut in half in the neoliberal period, globally, I'm talking about, right? Globally, taxes reduced by half since the 80s in almost all countries, including Mexico. So that's a big victory of the neoliberal movement. United States, nobody knows this, used to have a 70% tax rate. United States of America had a 70% tax rate, 7-0 on the rich, right? Today that is, what is it today, 27 or something? So it massively got reduced over time. It's important to understand that there was a time before this where taxes were so much higher that we can't even imagine that this happened in the West, in liberal countries, not even socialist ones. Socialist ones had 90% tax rates on the rich. Now that got massively reduced. You have this obsession with inflation at all costs. So if you have massive unemployment to keep inflation low, that's okay. Why? Because not having inflation means that the money that the rich have keeps their value, right? If you have high inflation, you have a lot of money, you lose money. Therefore, inflation is so important to neoliberals, because the capital of the rich would change with inflation. You have this breaking of organized labor. The trade unions are the big enemies. They've been extremely successful in this in North America. In the United States, unionization rates are the lowest they've ever been. All the big companies don't have unions. Amazon doesn't have a union. They won their fight against the union yesterday, I think. They were going to unionize, but they failed. Walmart doesn't have unions. All these big ones don't have unions. The reduction of public spending, right, on public service and social programs. Saving on the government is not a neoliberal thing, necessarily. Saving on social spending is neoliberal. It's an important distinction, right? Socialists can also save on things. It's only what you save on. If you save on reducing public services and basically anything that's redistributive, that's more a neoliberal thing, because you want people to be alone in the market. You don't want anything to hold their hand. Find your own housing, right? Don't rely on public housing. The downsizing of the government, I put this between brackets. This is a thing neoliberals will talk about. They almost never actually do this. I would say never, but I know one example where they did. That's David Cameron, the former Prime Minister of UK. To my knowledge, is the only neoliberal leader in history that actually downsized the government. Even Thatcher didn't actually reduce the government in total spending. Because you have more people each year, therefore normally things grow, right? You have economic growth, you have more income. Normally the government steadily grows for demographic reasons. In very, very rare circumstances, they'll actually do this, but they want it. Then you have the expansion of international markets, very important. As I said, neoliberalism is global. So it tries to lock all these things into one giant market, as we had various free trade agreements, and the removal of control on financial flows. Capital is global, and you don't want any restrictions on things like tax havens, or for you to hide your dark money, or for you to move to Andorra, for example, in the Mexican case, the Mexican political class, and have your money there. No taxes on Wall Street, etc., etc. Now, these are like the known things, right? These are, if neoliberals are in power, what they'll try to do. But I want to also talk about the very logic of it. When I said that they think that the market is the key to human progress, what does that actually mean, right? That breaks down, the market breaks down into a lot of principles that you could apply. On a much smaller level, even on a municipal level, This is just a bunch of techniques, a bunch of mechanisms that you can integrate into public policy, and you will see these as political science students in public policy, public management, whatever courses you're gonna have. If you have a good teacher, they're gonna explain you about. Don't smile, Mariana. You're gonna have good teachers. Come on now. What are you talking about? If they're good and show up, and not a senator, then you might learn about this. And I have to control myself because I used to teach public management, and I cannot give any examples, or not much, or this class will be over. But I just want you to have an idea of how neoliberalism looks like if you break it down in very small elements, right? And if you apply it in actual practical, let's take municipal level politics. And this happens if it's in power or not. This is how it just sneaks in. You'll see part of that even in the federal government. Little parts of this coming true. So you have supply and demand. That's an obvious one, right? You create markets, okay? But also supply side subsidies, for example. What does that mean? That means that if you want something done, right, there's two ways of doing it. One is paying money to actually do it, and the other one is to somehow subsidize people that then might do it. Okay, that's vague. Let me give an example. If AMLO wants more trees, he's going to plant more trees because that gives you more trees. Even neoliberal wants more trees, he's going to cut taxes on trees and give subsidies to companies to plant trees, right? One is demand side. You're going to make sure it actually happens. That's the socialist way. You're just going to pay to do it. Supply side is you give subsidies to the capitalist class who then might do it, right? Or you want to boost, let's say in the pandemic now, you want to protect the economy. So demand side economics would be that you're going to give money to people, and then people as consumers spend. Supply side subsidies mean that you're going to give tax breaks to companies or subsidies to companies, right? Neoliberalism will favor the supply side of this. You have internal markets. What does that mean? That means that the state is going to try to behave internally like a marketplace. So for example, we have the barracks of Guardia Civil, right? You probably have one near your home. Can we liberalize their kitchen? Like, can we have Subway inside the barracks of Guardia Civil? Can you, in our faculty, right, we have privatized lunch. Although we are a state institution, you have private companies running the cafeteria. Those are internal markets. You're going to try to, inside the state, organize markets. You have efficiency. Efficiency is not only for neoliberalism, but efficiency is a neoliberal value. So efficiency means that you're going to do things as fast as possible, right? Efficiency means that if you are social services and you help poor people who cannot understand their bills, for example, as a social worker, efficiency means that you have 7 minutes per client. And if they're in the middle of 7 minutes of explaining something that, oh, my husband just died, and like, next one, if you should have spoken faster. This is a literal example from my old city, Antwerp, that had 7 minutes per client. That's efficiency, right? You put everything in an Excel flowchart and you make sure, like McDonald's, you make sure it happens. You have outsourcing. So the government in neoliberal cases will do things, the taxpayer will pay for it, but they'll contract private companies to actually do it, right? Private security firms, public transport in Monterrey is outsourced. The government pays, but Feria does it, a private company does it, and you also pays, everybody pays for the bus. Results-based incentives, this is a peculiar one. This means that, well, what it says, right? You get paid if you get the job done. You get paid per piece, but inside the government. So that would mean that I would get paid depending on your grades. Or it's an extreme example, but does exist. So you get paid based on outcomes, which is good but also has some very perverse effects, because you will, for example, if we talk about social services again, you will always go for the easier client, because the easier client has a higher chance of success. You not the troublesome one that actually needs you. You're going to try to ignore that person because you're not gonna, this happens to me often, that as a foreigner, when I go to some service that has this and they see me, they're like, oh no, we don't want him. Extra paperwork, right? No, no, no. You wait over there. Let's first earn this money and help these other clients. That's because of results-based incentives. The idea of citizens as customers, right? The idea that you're not just a citizen, you're a customer, with all the negatives and positives that come with that. And then there should be service towards you, which is a good thing. An interesting one, I know I talk a lot, right? I'm sorry, that's the concept. Vouchers. So this is an interesting one, the one that I'm not necessarily against, depends on the sector. What does this mean? This is a variant of supply side thing. Education is a clear example here. Either the state could organize education to provide education to everyone, or they could give a very small subsidy to children, and then the children can use that to buy education. So instead of offering the service, you will give money to the client, who then in a market situation has to, well, figure it out what they're going to do. This can work given the voucher is high enough. For example, with handicapped people, severely handicapped people, like mentally challenged people, right? Mad people. You could either spend money on a rehab facility, or you could give money to those people who then could spend it on rehab. And the logic is that since you create a market, you create competition and you will have lower prices. That's a good scenario. In a bad scenario, the market doesn't actually offer something for them and they're just homeless. But it could work. This can work in some situations. Contractualization. You think of bureaucracy as a state thing, right? As the ultimate government thing. Until you lose your debit card, or there's something wrong with it, or the machine swallows it, and you need to go through hours of paperwork at the bank to get it back. Neoliberalism and capitalism comes with an enormous amount of paperwork in practice. Because everything is contractualized, everything is on paper. If you go to a private hospital, oh my God, my baby busted his lip, he's bleeding. You're like, well, sit aside, sir, and fill in these 40 forms of paper, right? That comes with it. Everything's on paper, and if it doesn't say it on paper, it didn't happen. That's part of it too. And public-private investment, that one you understand, right? Things like in the Tren Maya, for example. Not a neoliberal project, but they didn't have enough money, so they invited some other investors in this. It's a public-private partnership. I'm going to keep it moving. I could keep talking about this, but I shouldn't. Because, dear Sophia, Diego, Hugo, Mariana, and Diego, again, we have to talk about the trickling down, the dripping down of neoliberalism. I know if your knowledge of contemporary hip-hop is good enough to know this picture. So I want to talk about how it spreads. I think that's important. Rather than critiquing it, I think it's important you understand when this is happening and to recognize the spread of neoliberalism, particularly also in Mexico. And I want to talk about how it spreads on an ideological level and how it spreads on a policy level, starting with the ideas, right? How the neoliberalism became popular as an idea. I'm going to talk about the yin and the yang of neoliberalism, because it has two faces. It has a positive side that talks good about capitalism, and it has a negative side that talks bad about society. And they kind of work together, like yin and yang. So first talk about the positive one, the one of Milton Frieden, which is the idea that capitalism is great, it's going to save us, right? So these are ideas that I just explained, that the market offers solutions, right? That if we just apply these things on my previous slide to everything, and not just the mechanisms, also the norms, the mentality of the market, etc. If we're going to do that, then we're going to solve the problems, right? Hey, what about the voucher system? This, right? The problem with AMLO's ideas is not that they're bad, is that they're old. A quote from Anaya. This is what he's talking about. We need market principles to be introduced here. That type of rhetoric, right? I'm not going to go into detail on anything. I just want you to recognize the type of rhetoric. Neoliberalism has to spread the idea that globalization is a positive thing. Neoliberalism is married to globalization. It doesn't work without it. Well, I'll explain that on another slide, but it must defend it. In contrast to other types of right, nationalism is not married to neoliberalism. Conservatism is not married to neoliberalism. Globalization is, but yes, I said it wrong. Anyway, you get my point. The idea that globalization is development in both directions. Globalization means development. It will bring benefits to the country. And in the other sense, development means globalization, right? What development really means is economic integration. If a country is economically integrating, if it is rising GDP, that's what development means, right? Not reducing poverty or anything like that. Bigger cash flow, more trade, that's what development means. The marrying of these two ideas here, right? And what globalization is to neoliberal, what they will sell, is, well, it's an opportunity for more investments, right, to come to your country. And if you don't like that, there'll still be cheap imports, right? You might not like China, but you all like $2 t-shirts. So that's the selling point, right? It's a literal selling point in this case. So the popularization of this, and it comes with all kind of imagery of making you dream about traveling, although you never will, but you know, all these influences and things like that. This is all part of that globalization, yeah. Energy that comes with it. Also, neoliberalism is typically optimistic about technology. Why? Because neoliberalism causes a lot of problems, right? These deregulation, the regulation are rules against problems. If you take them away, you get problems. Social, environmental, etc. And neoliberalism has no answer to this. Well, the market is going to solve it, but whatever. So they have to put their hope on technology, right? Oh, but Elon Musk is going to save us, right? Oh, but this new, hey, take a straw, right? Or, yeah, there's a lot of insecurity, but with Uber Mujeres, you can still get home safely, right? Install the app. Technology is necessary. Technology is the thing that has to save the day because of all these problems that are generated. So they're going to be very optimistic about it, right? This whole futuristic thinking and always the next thing, the next gadget is a neoliberal idea. And if you like new technology and like things, you're kind of drawn into the orbit of this ideology. And away from haters like me who don't like new technology. Then there's this focus on social mobility and the gospel of social mobility, right? The get rich or die trying type of ideology that comes with it. This is again is a crucial idea to soften the ground for neoliberalism. Why? The principal idea, right, is that markets can solve everything. That money can solve all your problems. So if you have problems, the best solution is that you get rich, because then you're going to solve your problems, right? So we're not trying to solve your problems. You have to get rich. That's the real answer to anything, right? So if you live in a bad neighborhood, there's massive holes in the floor, you have no electricity, you're like, Mr. Neoliberal, we need electricity. He's going to say, pause. First of all, mijo, there is no we. Second, you need to get out of that neighborhood, right? You need to get a better job. We ain't fixing your electricity, right? The solution is that you leave. And that rhetoric is very important. For example, when it comes to wages, right? If you say, oh, well, mechanics have low wages in Monterey, that's bad. The liberal answer is, well, then stop being a mechanic, right? Get an education, become a lawyer. So you even blame people for their own low wages in this logic. While in Sweden, a mechanic will just earn the same as everyone else. That's the socialist answer, right? You just equalize wages. The neoliberal answer is that you get a better job. So social mobility is always the answer to things. And of course, this idea of capitalists as heroes that come to save the day, game show hosts, etc., that are going to make things better, right? If only we had a CEO as president, like Vicente Fox or Donald Trump, everything would work out. So, and you can see if you look at this list that this is very successful, right? This positive spread of ideas has happened, right? Travel, globalization is very popular. Technology is very popular. This mentalidad de tiburones, whatever you call it, is very popular. You have to get up and make it for yourself. This has been successful. And that's how you should want it, right? You want ideologies to stress their own positives. But there is also another side to this. There's the yin also of neoliberal ideas, which is equally popular. So this is the spread of ideas that go against the alternative to neoliberalism, that go against, in short, organized society, which comes in two forms. One is the government, one is, let's say, communities, and they're both bad. So, and this is more the area of people like Buchanan that I talked about earlier. That's the grandpa at the bottom. Starts with the idea that the state is bad, right? That the main fight in politics is individual versus state. That idea. The state is oppression. The state is dominance. The state is the main force that's trying to control you, Mariana. And we need to get rid of the state. Right? The state is not empowering. The state is not something that gives you rights or helps you or provides you education. The state is oppression. It's the main barrier to individual freedom, right? Which is a very ideological position because, in my view, as sociologist, there are other power structures in life that are more dominant than the state. There's people who have more power over you, like the boss of your parents, that can impact your life a bit harder than I can, representing the state. I can too, actually. Maybe they're equal. But anyway, there's more power sources in society than that. But the idea is to narrow it on the state. The state is your enemy. And interacting with the state is bad. Right, there's bad news. Oh, you need to go to civil registry. Oh my God, yes, the government. You have this phrase that I think Reagan popularized, that the scariest words in American language are, I am from the government and I'm here to help you, right? That idea, that's bad news. And it comes with the idea that the government, the state, is the real problem here. They're the creator of problems. In normal political theory, the government solves problems. That's what politics is. But this is flipped on its head here. Again, Reagan, I think the government is the problem rather than the solution, is I think, probably misquote from him. He said something like that. This idea that anything the government touches is failure, right? And if only it was more like the market, if only the government was like a company, the private sector would do this better, right? Not for the same price, of course, but the private sector would do it better. Oh my God, your uncle got sick and had to go to a public hospital. Oh, I feel bad for you, right? Oh, you go to uni, right? So they will tell you that attack, like this painful face when I say I teach at uni, like, oh, I'm sorry for you, professor. It's okay, it's okay. Now here's the important thing. They want you to think the government is a failure, right? Sometimes they are the government, though. So this can be self-inflicted. And I want you to see this in practice, that neoliberals, if they can do a bad job, they often will. Because yes, it will cost them votes, but it will make you believe that the government is trash and that you cannot rely on them. You will often see this. For example, in Trump administration, they gave education to Betsy DeVos, which was a lobbyist for private education. So the private education lobbyist was in charge of public education. She took half the money out of it. Everything went to hell. And she smiled. She was like, yeah, see, public education, it's crap, right? Come to private. Same with housing. They gave it to Ben Carson, total idiot. If you do a bad job as the government, as neoliberal, you're winning because you're eroding trust in the government. If you're corrupt, right? What's the best way to kill social services? Put a total corrupt person, in this Mexico's case, Rosario Robles, in charge of it that actually steals from the poor. Now the government will never, and other people won't trust, what was she in charge of? Anyway, I lost my train of thought. I lost the word. Come on, people. How's the social services called? The main one. The federal one. No? Anyway.
What did you ask? Or what?
The main social agency that helps poor people from the government is...
Cedesol.
Cedesol, indeed. Right? Put the corrupt people in charge of Cedesol, rob everything, and now people will be like, yeah, the government is trash, right? I know this is a very conspiracy theory, but I want you to be able to see this in practice. That they will often screw up, in my view, on purpose to erode trust in the state. If there's an earthquake, don't help people, right? Or help them a month late so they know that, oh, I can't count on the government. Things like that. You will see on the opposite end that the left will try to help as soon as possible, not just for moral reasons, but also to show that the government can do stuff, right? So that's one side of the spectrum. The other thing is not just against the state, it's against collectives in general. The idea that people as groups are dangerous. The Americans have this saying, you start noticing if you talk to enough gringos, oh, Americans, we're great as individuals, but we're terrible in a group. That's part of this type of rhetoric, the idea that if people come together, they become dangerous. So a democracy can be dangerous, not voting in itself, but actual people power, right? The majority wanting something and getting it can be very dangerous. They could raise taxes, for example. They could create new rules. They could limit your freedom. They could tell you, Mariana, that you cannot dye your hair green, right? Maybe you need protection from that. So you want to have very strong limits on government, right? To make it very hard to change anything. Very strong constitutions, all these checks and balances that in practice mean that you cannot change rules of the game. But also union power, right? Unions are evil. How do you undercut unions? By putting corrupt people in charge of them. You find the worst people in the country, you insert them in the two most powerful unions. That is the oil union and the teachers union, right? You have Duchamp with the oil, you have Esther with the teachers, and people think unions are trash, right? people's general terrible opinion of unions in Mexico, that's not a coincidence. Because you want people to think unions are trash, because you don't want them to join them, because unions take away power from the capitalist class. So you spread this distrust. And lastly, you want to break solidarity, right? Because solidarity leads to collective action. Solidarity leads to redistribution. It's bad. So you portray solidarity as a burden of individuals. For example, these are very subtle things. Have you noticed that in many American states, they don't tell you taxes in the price? Like you buy something and then you actually need to pay more than the thing it says on the label, because they'll charge you taxes afterwards, right?
Yeah.
That's inefficient. Why would they do it? To remind you that you're paying taxes. So every time you buy an apple, you're like, oh yeah, and the extra, in Europe, it just is labeled like you never notice taxes. They just happen invisibly. You want to make this very visible. You want to make it feel like, oh my God, I'm paying. So like they remind you could earn this much if you didn't pay Social Security, but hey, you're maintaining these sick people. So solidarity has to feel like a burden. It stops us, it slows us down from development. If only we didn't have to care about these poor and these sick and these old people, society would be better. So neoliberalism comes with this stigma against the poor, right? The poor are poor because they want to. Your uncle's favorite motto. Very, very well far spread stigma, right? And it's necessary to make people believe that. So neoliberalism, its idea is they have a positive side, pro-market, we're moving forward, technology, yeah, but there's also a negative side to it, the type that talks down on other ideas. Now, they don't just win with ideas alone. There's also power involved here. So when we talk about the diffusion of neoliberalism, I'm going to start talking faster because I have less time. I want to point out two things here that help neoliberalism become as dominant as it is. Again, they won some elections in UK, in US, and in India, and some other minor countries, but they mainly got their power via other ways. One of them is via international organizations. So I said before, neoliberalism is explicitly global, right? It has to be, because international competition is an integral part of it. If you don't have the threat of companies leaving, if you don't need to attract companies from other countries, if you're not in competition with the minimum wage of your neighbors, you're not going to vote neoliberal. Without this threat of competition, without this global system, you have much less incentive to deregulate or to privatize. So you need this global market. It's an essential part of it. And thus, neoliberalism comes with a plan to integrate the whole world into a market. And that's an explicit plan, written down like that and pushed by many organizations, because many organizations became convinced of that. Two examples of this. One, the main tool of this was via financial organizations. You've heard the story before. I think you've heard about the IMF before, so I'm going to quickly repeat it. The mechanism here is that you have organizations that will lend money to countries, right? Countries that need it, or they'll lend other privileges to them. But anyway, you're in economic trouble, you need help. They're going to give you help. But unlike a normal bank, they don't just charge you interest, they charge you change. So you need to pay money and you need to change your policies. Explicitly, you sign this. In exchange for this money, I'm going to do this. Now, why is this so powerful, right? And what they want are privatizations, opening the market, cutting social spending, anything I listed. Why is this so powerful? Because now neoliberalism can work even when it's not in power, right? The most tragic example of this is from Greece, 2015. The communists won the election. The communists were in power, but they, because the previous government had enormous debts. The last government was like, you throw out all the money, you communists, screw you, right? You inherit this burning house. And they own debts, among others, to the IMF and the to some European countries. And they immediately came. They were like, okay, you need to pay now. Like, but we can't. You need to pay now. It's time. Yeah, but come on, man. Give us 2 years now. And they try to resist, and they just cut off their money. Literally, European Central Bank stopped giving Greece euros. So if you went to the ATM, no money would come out. Like, they blocked the entire country's bank accounts of all people, not just politicians. So the communists were like, well, either we're going to die or we're going to do this. So the communists privatized everything. Right? They have to sell the harbor, they have to sell energy, they have to sell water to private investors to not have the country stop existing, basically. So here you see how powerful this is. You can even turn communists into neoliberals with debt. Who does this? Mainly the IMF, International Monetary Fund. This is their whole game. They're made for this. IMF changed in the last 5 years because France was playing 3D chess, and France was able to put a socialist in charge, or former socialist in charge of the IMF. And now the IMF kind of became to the center, ending this 30-year neoliberal streak. There's others to much lesser extent. You have the World Bank. The World Bank does the same thing, except less aggressively, because the World Bank has in its very DNA, in its mission, its constitution, that they have to help development and fight poverty. So they're not going to ask you to cut social services, because they can't do that, because that's not what they're about, right? They'll still push for privatization, opening markets, these kind of stuff, but it's not this, they're much less aggressive. And you have the World Trade Organization, will do similar things, not with debt, but with trade. Except again, they're not on the same level, because the World Trade Organization, as the name says, is the World Trade Organization. That's just what they do. You can't fault them for, hey, you're for free trade. They're like, yeah, man, free trade organization. So you know what you get if you sign up with them, right? So that's one mechanism, how you can manipulate. This is particularly powerful in Africa and in Latin America, right? All these countries have debts, usually for colonial times, and that keeps them in hand. Which explains a bit why AMLO is so much against debt, if you didn't understand why. Some people think it's because he's a neoliberal. It's the opposite, right? It's chess again. Now, the other thing is the power of multinationals. Multinationals in politics became more important in the last 30 years. They got a more direct role. By design, many laws give legal power to corporations. I'm not gonna, I teach international law, so it's very hard for me not to digress to that. But many trade agreements, for example NAFTA, for example TMAC, for example the Trans-Pacific Partnership, they have rules that allow companies to sue governments when those governments do things that the companies perceive threaten their future gains. So if a government does something that in the future might make you make less profit, right? Not directly affect you, but make you make less profit, you can try to seek legal action against governments. So things like raising a minimum wage, for example, or environmental regulations, right? Government has to fight always. You don't notice this because this happens in the background, hidden away. But the government has to fight all kinds of legal battles, usually wins these battles, but companies have this power. You see this now with the energy reform. Government tries to change the energy things. They get slapped with amparos from all directions by usually international companies. And that grinds it to a halt. Because they have more power than they used to. There's companies themselves. In the secondary order, you have this prominence of rating firms like Moody's and Fitch. If they say, oh, I think this leader is doing bad, they'll change your qualification, that will impact your market, stocks are going to crash. You're like, oh, this happened with AMLO with the airport, right? He said he was going to stop it, market crashed, everybody in panic. That's the power of markets like that. And consultancy firms, of course, have to keep it pushing. Lastly, neoliberalism will spread sometimes by force. And this is particularly relevant in the Latin context, right? It will spread via ideas, it will spread via organizations, and sometimes it will spread via the American army. It is a simple fact of history that in Latin America, neoliberalism is hard to separate from US imperialism. In Mexican history, in many histories of countries, they're the same thing. These are ideas coming from US because it benefits them, right? This is not coincidence. Why? Because if other countries privatize, US usually is going to be the one buying it, not the United States themselves, but their capital. So it's a way of consolidating the US grip on Latin economies. If they open up, United States investors can buy, and therefore you consolidate the market position. And well, it's in their strategic interest. Also, it works via training leaders. A lot of the elites that rule neoliberal countries were literally trained in the United States. If you think about neoliberal era in Mexico, the Madrid, Salinas, Cedillo, Fox, and Calderon all went to Ivy League, right? Almost all of them studying economics in the United States. This is not really a coincidence. In Bolivia, in the last coup in Bolivia, all army people who were involved, all of them went to the same summer camp in the United States 4 years earlier. These things have their way of happening, right? And so, but that's indirect. That's just by training elites, etc. Sometimes it's very direct, right? We talked about it before. You have direct intervention. The most famous one of them is Operation Condor. You will not waste 10 minutes of your life by reading Wikipedia on this. It will be a great 10 minutes of your life. Operation Condor, officially starting in 75 till 89, was an explicit deal between the CIA and governments of other countries or right-wing parties to have a series of coups against the left in Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, Brazil, all these countries, Venezuela. When they were not in power, they would overthrow these governments. When they were in power, CIA would help them with information, for example, to suppress the left, to suppress their rebels or left-wing parties. This happened. This is a historical fact. This is documented by the CIA. These documents are public now. You can read about them. Now, why is this neoliberal? You might say, that's just the United States messing with things. Yeah, but what happened the day after was the same in all these countries. What happened the day after these things took place was increasing the debt, increasing inequality, privatization, tax reform, deregulation, and the whole list of neoliberal policies, right? This again is not a coincidence. This is a direct causal relationship between the two. Even recently in Bolivia, our good friend Evo Morales, my good friend, he got removed from office based on a lie. Then the new government was there, but their only task was to arrange elections. That somehow took a year. And in the meantime, like a bunch of things, energy got privatized, a bunch of mines got, that just happened on the background. It is just part of organizing elections, I guess. And well, there's no way back now, right? Once you privatize something, unless the army is going to take it back by force. That's how it is. So the circle here is that the United States will insert itself in a country by investing in it, like we are dependent on them, right? That will give them more political power, which will then lead to privatizations. They will be the ones buying these state companies, their people. And that will again lead to more US integration, which will lead to more political power, which will lead to more neoliberalism, and you have this spiral. And it's a spiral that the current government is trying to stop, for better or worse, right? Because maybe this is what's helping Latin America forward, this neoliberalism. So, as you can see, it's a strong force, right? They have a lot of tools in their box, and that explains why they got so powerful. The only thing they're bad at is their street game. They're still not really on top of things with that. Now, do you have any questions for me? Or things you want to say?
I have a question. It's more like a theoretical one. Should we
Okay.
consider neoliberalism as the clash of capitalism or the first that will lead to the clash of capitalism, or it will occur under any other system?
I don't think you can divorce it from capitalism. No. Because, well, it's a class ideology. It seeks that. Or did I misunderstand your question?
No, but like what I meant is like under neoliberalism, capitalism will clash. So
You mean that you think that neoliberalism will increase the internal conflict of capitalism?
yes, that.
Well, that's extremely dangerous way of thinking, as always with you, Miss Sophia. Um, because you have like, there's this side of the left, the, how will I call them? The miserabilist left, who want to see capitalist disaster. They're like, the more capitalism, the better, because the bigger you have this internal contradictions and the closer we are to the revolution, right? I'm very wary of this type of left because usually you have to wait a bit longer than you think. They're like, yeah, let's have capitalism in Africa. And then 200 years later, they're still poor, right? And the revolution still didn't happen. So, yes, I think neoliberalism will increase the internal conflict within capitalism, especially ecologically. I don't think that's something that socialists should hope for, because capitalism is like a house. If it collapses, it's going to collapse on you because you're inside the house, right? I'm much more for reconstructing the house. Now we still can, and getting out of it, something like that. But yeah, it definitely has no answers to its own problems. Right? The answer is always more capitalism. The answer is that if the path's on fire, you just need to run faster, right? And get to the end of the tunnel, and then there's going to be redemption. But it does increase these problems. I don't know if I gave a good answer. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Well, because I was thinking like, okay, first of liberalism, then then we have neoliberalism, and maybe like for environmental issues, we're going to say, you know what, like this isn't working. We need to change it, and because there are too many contradictions under neoliberal system, so we will like say, ah, well, let's think about social democracy or something like that. I don't know, because I don't know, like I maybe it's a mistake of mine, but I feel like neoliberalism is like in the top of like capitalism. Like it's one of the it shows capitalism really really well. So I was just like wondering if neoliberalism will lead us to something more like
Well,
liberating, like not socialism or communism, I don't know, but something better.
well, that is possible. I think it creates an opportunity, but I don't dare to predict history like that. The left has been often wrong in underestimating capitalism and just how good it is at hiding problems. Um, and neoliberalism has this whole apparatus for doing so. So we'll see. It's possible. Any other questions or remarks, comments?
Doc, Dr. Diego put a question in the
Oh,
conversation.
dollarization. Well, I don't have a big story about that. I assume you mean by that countries start using US currency, right? But I don't know much about that phenomena. Besides that, it kind of raises the stakes, because the more countries that use dollars, the more important the dollar is. It also means that if the dollar crashes, the world is more and more in trouble. But I don't have any strong views on this. Maybe you do, and you want to talk about that.
Is that I was reading about Ecuador, and it said that they dollarized their economy, but I didn't understand why.
Probably because a lot of countries in Latin America, for overall quite obscure reasons, have very weak currencies. I cannot explain you why this is, and it doesn't really make sense to me. But countries like Argentina, for almost to me magical reasons, now and then just crash because their currency becomes worthless overnight, despite being not different than us economically. But that's, I don't know, that's a South American thing that people don't trust currencies. So for a lot of these countries, they get tired of these sudden crashes and they might want to switch to the dollar, which does not depend on them, which depends on US, and provide more stability to them economically. Of course, it makes them dependent on the US central bank, um, but it could provide them more stability because the dollar doesn't depend on you. And in some situations, I really understand why you would do that.
All right, I thought it was like a very hard topic, but it doesn't sound like a big deal.
Yeah, but finance is really complex, especially when it comes to those type of subjects. I don't think too many people truly understand, like even academics, what exactly causes these things or how that will impact. I think that's very unpredictable. Any other questions you have about neoliberalism? If not, did you like this lecture? Or was this too one-sided?
Yeah, like yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it was
Next,
a good
yeah.
continuation to the other class from the last semester. Like it was good.
Okay, thank you. So next time, two ladies and three gentlemen, you guys are going to present, right? About neoliberalism. How is that going? The preparation for that?
Well, it's going.
It is going. That says
Yeah.
something.
But I had a question. Like the point is to compare the policy on the in different countries, right?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Excellent.
So preferably the same policy, right? Preferably privatization to privatization. If that's not possible, I think it is possible. If that's not possible, you can compare different policies. But yeah, the goal of me is that we gonna talk a bit about this in practice, right? It's a homework for you, but I just want to have a nice class about this,
Teacher,
and for you to see it in practice. Yes.
I was investigating, and some of the instruction says that on the 21st century, but some of those policies in Ecuador and Chile were made on the 90s. So is that a problem?
Yes. So yeah, I want you to talk about things that happened in the last 20 years. Sometimes they started earlier, right? So if it's about something that started earlier but still going, so let's say they start negotiating an economical treaty in the 90s, but it was signed in 2000. You can include that, but I want to keep it within your lifetime, let's say. So yeah, a lot of things happened earlier, but I would like to talk about the more recent events. In Ecuador, I think a lot of things happened recently, right?
Yeah. Okay, thank you, teacher.
So, for example, in Mexico, this is not about Salinas. Yes, I know Salinas did the big things. If you talk about trade agreements, for example, right? Yeah, he did NAFTA, but other trade agreements, Trans-Pacific, TMAC, were done after him, right? Were done in this century. The Pacific Alliance, there's many trade agreements that are from the last 20 years that you could talk about. All right. We have to keep it moving. You have other classes, hopefully, after this, and I will see you on Thursday. Good?
Thank Doctor. It was nice to see you.
Yes.
Goodbye. Have a
Very
nice day.
nice to see you.
See you.
Bye.
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 Take care.